I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Bhrigupati Singh to Columbia. He is an assistant professor in anthropology and a faculty fellow at the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University. He received his PhD from Johns Hopkins, where he studied under Veena Das. And I have to say, perhaps the first essay I read of yours was your conceptual Vita, which in Wording the World, Veena Das and Scenes of Inheritance, where you trace her scholarly life in, I thought, a really interesting way as a kind of a personal journey that has been responsive to a series of historical and critical events, and identifying shifts in her conceptual preoccupations over her three books, and over three books that had implications for the broader history of anthropological thought. I thought that was really grabbed me. And I think your career has gotten off to a remarkable start with an incredible amount of energy and prolificness. He's the co-editor of The Ground Between, Anthropological Engagements with Philosophy, and serves as an associate editor of HOW, the Journal of Ethnographic Theory. And his book, Poverty and the Quest for Life, Spiritual and Material Striving in Rural India, published in 2015, is the winner of 2 prizes. This book returns ethnographic attention to rural India, challenging the prevailing focus of anthropologists on urban centers as the locus of vitality and political process. It's a study of a scheduled tribe in a poor region of Rajasthan that disrupts commonly used vocabularies of state corruption, failure, and despair, to focus instead on complex thresholds of life that can be found amongst this tribe/caste group. And anyway, I've also found it quite a page turner, which I wouldn't have expected for this. He's more recently turned in the direction of mental health and efforts to unsettle what has been, I know I've personally experienced this troubled divide between anthropological and psychiatric approaches to distress. He's investigated religious and secular forms of healing for common mental health disorders in urban North India, specifically focusing on the urban poor and on anxiety disorders as a window into contemporary India. You're also currently working on essays on philosophical and literary concepts of vitalism and its relation to anthropological understandings of everyday life. So, an incredibly rich array of topics that you've been looking into, with always a nice, coherent agenda underlying them all. Today, we will ask the question, can a nation fall sick? Thoughts on the opioid epidemic and other forms of collective self-harm in contemporary India. Please join me in welcoming
Would you prefer it if I sat, or is it okay if I, what would you prefer? Because for recording, is it preferable to, it's okay to sit? Okay. Thank you so much for the generous introduction and for coming out of your leave to host me, and sincere thanks to Professor Gauri Vishwanathan and Professor Ewing and to all of you at the South Asia Institute for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be able to present this quite new and uncertain material in a milieu that is really home to so many people when I look around, whose thoughts have left different kinds of imprints on my own older and new work. So thank you so much. My first book, as Professor Ewing had mentioned, Poverty and the Quest for Life, Spiritual and Material Striving in Rural India, had asked what aspiration and a higher quality of life, quote unquote, might mean in religious and secular terms for a community of former or current bonded laborers in rural Rajasthan. In today's talk, I'll be describing aspects of my current phase of research that I began in 2015, which continues many of the interests of my first book in issues of vitality and well-being, now conceived in closer conversation and contestation with psychiatry. For many of us in the humanities and social science, even the invocation of psychiatry might immediately bring up Foucault-infused images of carceral institutions, normalizing power, psychotropic drugs, and globally standardized categories that erase cultural particularities. Within anthropology, the dialogue with and aversion to psychiatry has far predated Foucault. From founding figures like Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict onwards, anthropologists across different generations have argued that what is considered abnormal is culturally specific. In a landmark 1985 edited volume that many of you might remember, Culture and Depression, Gananath Obesekre had famously argued that rather than being pathologies, many of the signature symptoms of depression, such as loss of attachment, non-responsiveness, or what psychiatrists call anhedonia, are considered as higher moral and spiritual goals, for instance in Buddhism. Some decades now after this 1985 volume, many argue that we now live in a completely different historical moment, this being the era of antidepressants and big pharma. As such, anthropologists of a current generation have begun to ask a different set of questions, that is to say how culture has come to absorb newness, such as new concepts and technologies, including psychiatric frameworks, in recent books like Depression in Japan and these books, which ask, for instance, Depression in Japan asks how beginning from the 1990s onwards, when the term depression was relatively unheard of, in the space of a decade or so it came to be seen as the national disease of Japan. And similarly with Iran, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Some authors, like this Crazy Like Us, this book, argue that what we are seeing today is simply the globalization of the American psyche. So in terms of psychic life, is the world finally flat, as Thomas Friedman had once put it? Or are there still ways to explore psychic crests and troughs and global and local variations without a falsely unifying concept of culture or an oversimplified Foucauldian model of governmentality and subjection, or some kind of vague conspiracy theory of neoliberalism, or a false antagonism between two fictitious or relatively fictitious entities called the West and the non-West? What are our concepts of psychic life at present? If we want to free ourselves for a moment from the disease classifications of psychiatry or from the somewhat overburdened inheritance of psychoanalysis, and I say this with some hesitation in Professor Ewing's presence, at times new concepts may emerge not necessarily ex nihilo, but from a rehabilitation of the old. For instance, ideas within the history of anthropology. In my own recent work, I found Gregory Bateson's idea of an ecology of mind to be quite helpful. As Bateson had suggested, rather than boundaries, a local ecology might be composed of circuits of mobility and stasis. Drawing on Bateson's idea of neural, social, etc. circuits, in recent years, anthropologists of mental health, such as Tanya Luhrmann and authors of the recent volume Addiction Trajectories, have emphasized how mental illness in Euro-American context often involves a potentially detrimental circuit that patients begin to traverse between homelessness, incarceration, and biomedical institutions in ways that serve to intensify the forms of what, in medical terms, sometimes they call social defeat and distress. So how might we think of circuits of mental health care in India? As a step towards my own work, allow me to briefly lead you through a particular ecology, a three-point circuit that I inhabited in the course of the last 4 years of research. I'll return in conclusion to the somewhat tantalizing title, Can a Nation Fall Sick? And what sickness might mean here, and how one might read symptoms of collective bodies, while also recognizing what is local about local ecologies. So let me begin by entering a specific ethnographic circuit. I spent July 2015 to August 2016 as a visiting faculty member at the Department of Psychiatry of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, known as AIIMS, in Delhi. Even for those of us who've lived or inhabited North India and Delhi and know about AIIMS, it is still a source of some surprise to consider that it is one of the last remaining democratic healthcare institutions in North India, whereas patients sometimes will jokingly say anyone from the Prime Minister to a homeless person might be found seeking treatment. When I was at AIIMS, a key location of my ethnography was the urban poor neighborhood of Trilokpuri in East Delhi, where the AIIMS Psychiatry Department runs a community clinic. Trilopuri is somewhat infamous in Delhi as a space of crime and smack or heroin addiction, remembered by many as the site of the highest death toll in the 1984 anti-Sikh riots, and having had a major Hindu-Muslim riot in 2014 and periodic skirmishes since. In news reports around the 2014 incident, NDTV, the news channel, coined the term riot laboratory for Trilopuri. Administratively, Trilopuri is a resettlement colony, a government term for settlements in which slum dwellers were forcibly or sometimes voluntarily removed from more gentrified parts of Delhi to small residential plots in what was then the outskirts of the city, outside, further north of the Yamuna, most famously in what were called urban beautification drives during the emergency, as Emma Tarlow and others have written about. Alongside administrative and spatial categories, how do we understand the composition of neighborhoods? What is a neighborhood? My earlier work in rural Rajasthan also made me look at cities quite differently now. For instance, better understood like villages primarily as caste-based clusters in poor and elite neighborhoods. At least that's how I came to see it. In Trilopuri, I found that the seemingly anonymous slum dwellers who were relocated to these resettlement colonies of Delhi, as it happens, belong to the lowest castes of the Hindu and Muslim hierarchy. So one way to consider a lower caste geography of a city like Delhi is to look at resettlement colonies, which are 55 in all across Delhi, each of which has an average population of about 200,000. The population of Trilopuri is 170,000. By far the dominant group numerically in Trilopuri are the Balmikis, the so-called sweeper caste, earlier called Bhangis, a term that is now illegal. Gandhi had famously called them Harijans. Trilopuri is divided into blocks numbered from 1 to 36. Most blocks in Trilopuri are known as either Balmiki or as Muslim blocks. And in a surprisingly understudied topic with rare exceptions, caste is a central social fact of South Asian Islam in ways that is significant even for mental illness, as I will emphasize ahead. As I moved between AIIMS, Trilopuri, a third key node in the circuit of mental health gradually emerged in the course of fieldwork, the Sufi shrine of Badaयूं, renowned for the treatment of mental illness, akin to the famous Mehdipur Balaji temple where Sudhir Kakkad, Graham Dwyer and others have conducted research. Hindu and Muslim treatment seekers from resettlement colonies across Delhi, like Trilopuri, regularly visit the Badaयूं shrine, led in the case of Trilopuri by a Muslim healer popularly known by everyone as Sufi Ji, who gradually became one of my closest interlocutors and hosts within Trilopuri. What I'm calling a circuit of mental health care didn't come to me fully formed. After a year of following treatment-seeking trajectories across AIIMS, Trilopuri and Badaयूं, it slowly became clearer to me that what I was traversing was in fact the circuit of mental health care in contemporary India that moves between hospitals, homes, neighborhoods and shrines in no particular order. Drawing on this field work, I'm working towards a book that I have tentatively titled Waxing and Waning Life, Investigations at the Threshold of Mental Illness and Health. You might notice that I haven't yet, until editorial pressure may do otherwise, put India in the subtitle to call it, say, Mental Illness and Health in India. This is partly an objection or a hesitation to the so-called non-West always being forced to be explicitly regional or national. And yet the question of what locality is remains critically important, as I hope to show you. In organizing the book as a whole, I found I was traversing the same three conditions that Bateson had written about: addiction, depression, and schizophrenia. These three conditions define relatively distinct strands of mental illness through which contemporary psychiatry is often organized. So psychiatric clinics typically will be organized along these three lines, even at AIIMS all over the world. Mostly severe mental illness, including schizophrenia, psychosis, and other disorders in this spectrum, as distinct from common mental disorders, including bipolar disorder, depression, and anxiety, with a third slightly separate category of addiction psychiatry. So that's how psychiatry clinics are often organized. Leaving schizophrenia and depression for another occasion, when I hope you invite me back, I will present a paper on schizophrenia. But today's talk, I'm focusing on an aspect of the contemporary mental health landscape that was initially not at all part of my research plan, but gradually became increasingly significant, namely opioids. In particular, smack or heroin addiction, drawing on two chapters in this book that I'm trying to write. The two chapters in this case being Can a Neighborhood Fall Sick and Heroes and Heroin. To offer you a brief roadmap of the talk that I'll be giving, as a first step, I ask what addiction is and where opioid painkillers and heroin fit within a global condition in which psychic life today maybe can't be understood without examining the place of drugs for good and for ill. Next, I briefly outline the available statistics for opioid and heroin addiction in India, at least the statistics available right now. I ask what anthropology might offer to these global and national pictures of affliction. As an instance of a problem that can't be addressed by statistical aggregates, I examine the surprisingly sharp variation in the pattern of heroin addiction and form of collective violence between two seemingly very similar resettlement colonies in Delhi, Trilokpuri and Sundarnagari. I suggest why such variations exist and how we might think of neighborhoods as a unit of analysis within the framework of an ecology of mind. Lastly, in understanding life and death in relation to heroin, I emphasize the significance of gender and the gender division of labor, care, and consumption in relation to drugs. So to move closer to heroin, for me, the imperative to study heroin addiction initially emerged ethnographically as I observed groups of smack addicts in parks and other public spaces in Trilokpuri and many other resettlement colonies, and the resulting forms of what sociologists and psychiatrists euphemistically sometimes call social disorder, which many argue, in public health particularly, can have significant neighborhood effects in terms of the feeling of safety, well-being, and the quality of life in a neighborhood. The main focus of the AIIMS clinic where I was based in Trilokpuri is opioid substitution therapy, which is also very big in America and many parts of the world, part of a set of global health initiatives funded by the WHO, wherein a heroin addict is given a regular dose of a less addictive and more economically manageable substitute opioid. And strange as it may sound to substitute one opioid for another, OST treatments can be life-saving for individuals and for households, even with the constantly in the US and in India accompanying danger of OST medications being resold in the open market as narcotics as well. The thin red line between addiction and medication reminds us that opioids are not inherently pathological. They are part of a spectrum of substances central to a contemporary ecology of mind, placed within larger histories of the substance-based management of well-being. As Derrida and others remind us, the word pharmakon, from which the word pharmaceutical is derived, means both remedy and poison. Contrary to a popular misconception that people in India and so-called non-West are more circumspect about consuming pharmaceuticals as distinct from people in the West, quite the opposite. I should mention that, for instance, over the last decade, India has emerged as the world's highest consumer of antibiotics, according to the WHO's World Antibiotics Report, far outpacing China and the United States. When does a remedy turn into a poison in a biological and social sense? Rather than taking a position for or against pharmaceuticals per se, we might focus on particular substances and ask what kind of an object heroin or opioids, more broadly, are, as distinct, say, from Prozac and other mood-altering substances on which there has been, in fact, rigorous philosophical discussion, like in this book, in terms of what the moral objection might be to pharmaceutically induced happiness. What is the problem? One objection to heroin is its propensity for addiction, overdose, and death tolls. On these counts, the worst hit country globally at present is the United States, currently described as being in the midst of an opioid epidemic, with opioid overdose being the highest cause of accidental deaths in the US at present. As the by now quite strong academic literature in the US describes it, the opioid crisis came as a shock to middle-class white America in the last decade or so, entering the body politic mostly through the route of opioid painkillers prescribed for conditions as innocuous as carpal tunnel syndrome and post-surgical recovery. After their legal supply was cut off by health insurance, large numbers of white American patients found themselves suddenly seeking out urban underworlds in search of opioid substitutes, most often black tar heroin said to come from Mexico. And now the debate in the last couple of years has moved even further within the US. In India, the transformation of opium into heroin or smack is dated to the mid-1980s, when it first became available via Afghanistan, according to the narratives of older addicts and sellers, and then gradually began to be produced locally, in particular in Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, the three states in India historically where poppy can be legally grown for medicinal purposes. Part of the legal poppy harvest is then siphoned off for the production of heroin, which can be synthesized as it now is in North India in one-room cottage industry type production units. So you need just a hut and very little to produce heroin. Is India going through an opioid epidemic like the United States? In media reports, People may have noticed Punjab is often depicted with sensationally high figures, which have come to be disputed within Indian addiction psychiatry, because it was found that the one empirical study on which these sensational news reports are based was set in only 3 districts of Punjab, renowned as the drug epicenter of the state. Precise number of overdose deaths nationwide in a place like India are quite hard to quantify, because deaths, particularly among the homeless in India, are often registered in mortuary records, and we went to many such places, often in registers as cause unknown, or with entries such as death by exposure to cold or heat, depending on what the season may be. Uncertainties notwithstanding, the numerical situation in India is not entirely unknown. There have been 2 national surveys of heroin use in India so far, in 2004 and a second more recent study in 2019 conducted by the AIIMS Psychiatry-run National Drug Dependence Treatment Center. The 2019 survey was overseen by my hosts, and one of my hosts in particular and co-author, Dr. Ravindra Rao at AIIMS. The survey covered 200,000 randomly selected households in 186 districts across all 36 states and union territories in India, alongside interviews with 72,000 drug addicts. Some of the findings of this 2019 survey are quite startling. The prevalence of opioid use in India is 3 times the global average. About 2.1% of India's population seemingly use opioids. More than Punjab, Uttar Pradesh has the highest number of people found with opioid use problems, although in terms of the percentage of population affected, the worst affected states are Mizoram and Nagaland. What kinds of diagnostics might anthropologists contribute to these national and global pictures of affliction if we want to offer something other than a concept of culture, or some vaguely formed objection to the very notion of quantification, or abstract invocations of the psychic pressures of neoliberalism in ways that would flatten out all forms of difference internal to particular milieus? Ecologically speaking, for instance, what kind of a unit of analysis is a city or a neighborhood in relation to substance use and abuse? My starting point for this question was a seemingly local difference between Trilopuri and another resettlement colony of Sundarnagari, where AIIMS also runs an OST community clinic. So AIIMS Psychiatry runs these 2 community clinics. The ethnographic imperative to investigate this was initially posed to me with some urgency by my host, psychiatry faculty and residents at AIIMS. You have to visit our other clinic, many of them said, and do a study to tell us why it's so different from Trilopuri. Different in what way? I asked. It's much more dangerous, they said, intriguingly. This other, more dangerous clinic was in Sundarnagari, 12 kilometers away, also settled in the exact same year as Trilopuri during the emergency in 1975-76. On first impressions, the Sundarnagari clinic did have a much edgier atmosphere. Fights broke out more often, patients often threatened doctors and staff verbally with knives. The patients, all male, were gaunter and had hollower, more ghostly eyes than I had seen in Trilopuri. There were much fewer accompanying wives and mothers whom one often encountered in Trilopuri. Rather than only a psychiatric power knowledge construction of risk and normalcy, in time I found that the difference between these 2 neighborhoods could also be posed in more emic terms in the language and experiences of addicts themselves. As most nashebaz, smack addicts will tell you, there are 3 ways to ingest heroin. You can smoke it, which is relatively expensive, costing about 250 rupees a piece, or you can chase it on a foil, a panni, which is slightly cheaper, about 200 rupees. And after that, in a downward hierarchy that most addicts confirm, in a different category from smokers and chasers come the injectors, with sui injections and shishi bottles with heroin and pharmaceutical cocktails, which you get from a chemist and not from a smack dealer, for rupees 40 or less, that is to say 1/5 the price of a smoker or chaser's habit. As most addicts put it, a chaser's life is 10 years long, an injector's life is 2 years at most. Addiction psychiatrists would agree, pointing to various vulnerabilities for injectors, including most prominently from a global health perspective, the risk of contracting HIV or hepatitis B through shared needles. So what we have are 2 quite different modes of heroin consumption, with smokers and chasers on the one hand and injectors on the other. Methodologically, based on repeat interviews over the last 3 years and patient files and days and nights that I spent in both neighborhoods with treatment seekers, addicts, male and female household residents, as well as household surveys in both neighborhoods, the initially intuitive difference gradually emerged more sharply. And here was the difference. Trilokpuri had barely a single injector, and I say this after visiting every smack dealer, every spot in and around the neighborhood where addicts hang out. In contrast, in Sundarnagari, used injections could be found everywhere, strewn in ordinary neighborhood spaces such as parks. Numerically, the difference is quite stark. According to current AIIMS clinic figures, out of 3,138 patients in Trilokpuri, there are only 4 injecting drug users, IDUs, and 6 HIV positive patients. In contrast, in Sundarnagari, out of a total of 1,773 patients, 300 are IDUs and 137 are HIV positive. On a national scale, IDUs in India show a much higher rate of HIV than, for instance, commercial sex workers, often assumed to be the primary drivers for the spread of HIV. As addicts put it, a chaser's life is 10 years long, an injector's life is 2 years at most. And so I slightly shift the guiding question for this talk: can a neighborhood fall sick in ways different even from a proximate locality? Injecting is one among other forms of self-injury or collective self-harm. Consider a different affliction that a psychiatrist would not focus on, but an anthropologist can, where the balance sheet of injuries between these two neighborhoods undergoes a sharp reversal if we turn to a form of injury that has been a classic site of a rich tradition of South Asian studies, namely collective violence. As I mentioned, Trilokpuri, as I told you at the beginning, the healthier neighborhood from the perspective of smack addicts, is also the one called the riot laboratory, as NDTV has named it. In contrast, there has never been a riot in Sundarnagari, as news reports and interviews and household surveys confirm. Like Trilokpuri, Sundarnagari is also very much a mixed Hindu-Muslim neighborhood, following census data and also our very own household surveys in 100 households in both neighborhoods that show a number of demographic similarities, including religion, place of origin, renters versus owners, the presence of government documents in households, and the general level of crime reported in both neighborhoods based on registered FIRs, which I tracked for 1 year between 2015 and 2016. The striking difference that interests me here is between two different forms of self-harm. Trilokpuri does not inject itself, but it produces periodic riots. No such riot has occurred in Sundarnagari. That is not to say that Hindu-Muslim animosity or the potential for violence doesn't exist in Sundarnagari. Since 2016, I closely followed and interviewed key players in 3 incidents of explicitly Hindu-Muslim disputes, framed as such within Sundarnagari, but which stopped short of explicit violence each time, such that Sundarnagari residents can still say, ours is not a danga-grast, riot-prone area like Trilokpuri. How might we find our conceptual bearings for what we are comparing here? Within the archive of social theory, I found it quite helpful to reread Durkheim's Suicide in relation to Trilokpuri and Sundarnagari, taking suicide not just to be a question of the endpoint of death, but what Durkheim in the book calls suicidogenetic currents, namely modes of self-harm which may or may not result in the immediate end of life. What kinds of suicidogenetic currents pass through a neighborhood, and how do these currents vary? Suicide is also a text, as many of us might remember, in which Durkheim compared different administrative districts of Europe to ask, I quote, how a definite number of people kill themselves in a particular way, repeatedly over time, and how these forms of death vary, sometimes quite sharply, between seemingly proximate areas. A second point of conceptual mooring comes for me from Deleuze's essays Critical and Clinical, in which, as Deleuze suggests, there can be forms of etiology, the identification and arrangement of symptoms, in particular psychiatric symptoms, that may occur in realms distinct from or adjacent to biomedicine. While Deleuze focuses on literary diagnostics with famous examples like Sade, Massoc, and Artaud, we might say that anthropology too offers forms of etiology, that is, at times, sometimes implicitly. The danger here is of our diagnosis becoming too unidimensional. For instance, when anthropologists identify but then reduce all social ills to a single formula, neoliberalism. And so what then do I offer as the diagnosis of the sharp differences in the nature of suicidogenetic currents between these two neighborhoods in Delhi? As anthropologists, we proceed through what we might call ethnographic singularities and patterns. Before we move to singularities, let me alert you to a pattern as I began to see it that occasion these differences. As with many things in South Asia, part of the answer is to do with caste. Instead of the more generalized category of Dalit or scheduled caste, if we notice the specific distribution of Hindu castes in these neighborhoods, Then in Sundarnagari, we find a mix of Koli, Weavers, Jata, Chamars, and other North Indian lower castes. In contrast, by far the dominant group numerically in Trilokpuri are the Valmikis, the so-called sweeper caste of Hinduism, as I said at the beginning. Nearly every professional city sweeper employed by the Municipal Corporation of Delhi and in India and in Pakistan, by the way, is a Hindu Valmiki by caste. We may not be Hindu in Pakistan. This sounds bad, but to be a state-employed sanitation worker is a salaried profession with a middle-range monthly earning which can be life-sustaining in the landscape of the urban poor, around 35 to 40,000 per month for a Pakka employee and about half of that for a temporary employee. Muslim families in both neighborhoods are often linked to the garbage and recycling economy as well, for instance as kabadiwalas or butchers and laborers. As anthropologists and others, including the Government of India's own 2005 Sachar Committee report had argued, a significant proportion of the Muslim poor may be seen as Dalit by occupation, socio-economic status and marriage-related practices. But since this social fact is denied theologically and governmentally, welfare and affirmative action programs are largely absent for Muslims and available for Hindus in what is perhaps one of the most systemic and far-reaching injustices in post-colonial India, in a kind of laboratory of inequality, sharply and completely visible in resettlement colonies in neighboring blocks. For now, let's stay with the question of the different suicidogenetic currents in these two neighborhoods. And here's a step towards an answer. Trilokpuri is more of a neighborhood of salaried professions, although at the lowest rungs of the social ladder. In contrast, Sundarnagari is almost entirely dependent on shops, thelas and daily wages. The injectors of Sundarnagari are almost all daily wage laborers. But that is not the entirety of the answer, even as we may be willing to acknowledge the depth of difference between salaried and daily wage labor. The economic difference is not determining, but it became significant when a more contingent set of very particular events occurred, as the chaska or craze for injections first spread in both neighborhoods, beginning quite datably just happened recently in 2007, as most addicts describe it, starting from Simapuri further north and then spreading to adjacent neighborhoods gradually. As Philippe Bourgois describes it in Righteous Dope Fiend, an ethnography of IDUs injecting drug users in San Francisco, among a group of injectors there's often an expert skilled at finding veins and key to initiating new IDUs. In Trilokpuri in 2007, as most ex-injectors in the neighborhood describe it, a set of botched injections led to a series of sudden deaths in the course of the initial 6 months. As Naresh Valmiki, one of the oldest patients in the Trilokpuri clinic, describes it, a friend of mine, Buddu, died in front of me with blood pouring out of his veins. Thar. After that, I decided it's better to spend the 200 rupees for panni, foil, rather than these dangerous injections. We even started beating up any injectors we saw, saying, "Hat gandi aadat phaila raha hai, karna hai to panni pe kar." That is, get out of here, stop spreading this bad habit. If you want to have heroin, then have it on a foil. We'd make the murgas, a humiliating form of punishment. Like the big fish, we ate up the small fish. Naresh could afford this switch back to the foil or panni because he's an MCD Safai Karamchari, that is cleaner sweeper, in charge of 3 lanes in block 2 of Trilokpuri. As with the partly mandated but also informally negotiated kinship arrangements within municipal corporations, Naresh inherited this job from his father's death, after his father's death. Some who are worse affected than Naresh, like his cousin Nitin, one of the HIV positive patients in Trilokpuri, gave up smack altogether, financially supported by his mother, an MCD sweeper. But what about the Muslim smack addicts in Trilokpuri? Hypothetically, they could have formed an injector subculture and found their own semi-public spaces within Trilokpuri. Why didn't they become injectors? Rather than economic factors, here I found a kind of metaphysical difference. Metaphysical in the sense of an afterlife, the impact that the death leaves on proximate others around you. For instance, among former addicts in Trilokpuri, the person I'm closest to is popularly known in the neighborhood as Asif Kebabwala, since he runs a buffalo meat kebab shop in block 27, the Muslim Gad or heart of Trilokpuri. Asif's brother Sultani died of an injection overdose in January 2008, as did his friend and neighbor Irfan. Nearly every member of Asif's family, his father, mother, his brother Rizwan, had described these deaths to me in separate interviews. Each of them described the same death, with details that, as I heard it, constitute a kind of mourning. Sultani screams the night before with tutan, that is breaking, the word for smack withdrawal. The 100 rupees that Asif's father gave him, unable to bear the screams. How this happened 2 days before Eid. All that was cooked for Eid that year. The 2 days for which Sultani disappeared. How he died in a garbage dump. How Asif heard about his death from the whispers of smack addicts in a public bathroom. How they rushed to Guru Tegh Bahadur Hospital to claim Sultani's body. How his body was about to be cremated rather than buried when they reached the morgue. A few months later, Asif gave up smack and even ganja, although now, even 10 years later, he still comes to collect his bi-weekly dose from AIIMS Psychiatry of the opioid buprenorphine from the Trilokpuri clinic. Sundarnagari, the other neighborhood, injector neighborhood, also saw a number of such deaths. As I tracked treatment dropouts, I found that there had in fact been a much higher number of heroin-related deaths toll in Sundarnagari than in Trilokpuri. The deaths in Sundarnagari were not unmarked, but living companions continued along a different trajectory of compulsion and forms of life and death. For instance, I have become quite fond of, I'm still fond of, Imtiaz, an injector in Sundarnagari, 20 years old, now 22, said to be a talented pickpocket, adept at stealing cell phones, usually working with two friends, Wasim and Johar, who both died during the course of my fieldwork. Johar was known for carrying a knife, even to the clinic, and for being easily provoked into using it. He often went to the clinic terrace to inject himself right after consuming his daily dose of methadone. Some of the other patients grimly murmured that he had begun to inject himself on his limb, penis. Ye last stage hota hai, this is the last stage when there are no other veins left. Kamlesh ji, the clinic's outreach worker in her 60s, whom the patients all affectionately called Mummy, still treated Johar warmly. Apni chain to upar kar le, at least zip up, she would yell as he returned after injecting from the terrace. It came as no surprise to us when we heard from Kamlesh ji one day that Johar's mother had called late last night to tell her that he died of an overdose. Imtiaz, still living, he still praised Johar. He wouldn't steal wallets, only mobiles. If it was a small mobile, he would throw it back down and tell the person they dropped their mobile. He was a real artist. Contrary to assumptions of abandonment, Imtiaz and Johar both had relatively supportive families. They had tried almost every legal occupation possible in Sundarnagari: waiter, tent wala, shop assistant, electrician. In these jobs, they could earn about 150 rupees a day. In contrast, 2 hours on the road and one cell phone could bring in rupees 10,000 or more, depending on the phone, for which there are many retailers in Sundarnagari. In 2015, Imtiaz's parents made a major attempt to get him out of all this. They took a loan for 80,000 rupees and bought him an e-rickshaw, but that was stolen within the neighborhood and Imtiaz relapsed. The day after Johar's death, after shedding tears with me and others in the clinic, Imtiaz rejoined an older injector called Chacha, whom he had distanced himself from after Chacha had left him bleeding in a ditch some months back to be rescued by the police. I hesitate to call this death without weeping, as Nancy Shepherd Hughes had famously put it in another context. Maybe there is no way to compare Imtiaz's tears for Wasim or Johar with Asif's, or to ask what Asif might have become had he lived in Sundarnagari rather than Trilokpuri. Instead, we might say that there are forms of life and forms of death that we become part of depending on the local ecology. As such, the contagion of injections caught and stayed and grew in the more unstable local economy of Sundarnagari, leading to the sharply different comparative figures between these two clinics. These local differences can be nationally quite significant, as we saw earlier with the figures for HIV in India. Trilokpuri, then, as we can see, is better on this scale. As an anthropologist, I can continue to ask further questions, fortunately, on the diagnostics of self-harm. As you might remember, there's a second part of the comparative equation. Trilokpuri has the riot laboratory, while Sundarnagari has no riots. This difference, strange as it might initially sound, hinges on a more open-ended valence of the term heroin and the ways in which substances and the sensations they produce exist on a continuum with ordinary life. I asked earlier, what is the experience of heroin? What kind of a substance is it conceptually? Different, say, from Prozac. The most common answer usually offered within the anthropology of addiction hinges on variants of heroin being a numbing response to abjection, alienation, and state failure. But there was a strange quality of life and energy shared by Imtiaz and Johar and Asif and addicts across Trilokpuri and Sundarnagari that made this cluster of terms, abjection, alienation, numbness, somehow feel not quite right. The quality I invoke is a kind of self-destructive masculine volatility that I sensed but didn't quite know how to name. Then, a footnote in the history of heroin that I chanced upon brought with it a new conceptual possibility. How did heroin come to be named as such? Why is it called heroin? In 1895, Felix Hoffmann, a German chemist working at Bayer Pharmaceuticals, still one of the leading pharmaceutical companies in the world, resynthesized diamorphine in an attempt to produce a less addictive opiate. The experiment mistakenly produced a substance twice as powerful as morphine, which for the next 12 years or so was assumed to be non-addictive. Hoffmann initially tried it out, this was the era pre-ethics test committees, etc. Tried it out on all the factory workers at the Bayer head office in Germany and asked them how they felt. And they reported that it made them feel heroic. The word hero comes from the Greek word heroon, a shrine meant to commemorate a kind of supernatural, ambivalent, potentially harmful potency of the dead. In light of this biochemical, metaphysical valence, I suddenly saw my addict interlocutors more clearly. Pickpockets, some neophytes, older retired toughs with their jail records and colorful names, Bhure, Kale, Angare, part of local legends, some of them subordinates to neighborhood big men or small political leaders. I was among fallen or falling heroes. If we view the heroic dimension of heroin not entirely as a delusion, but rather via Deleuze and Durkheim in relation to forces and currents, then ethnographic immersion tells us that smokers, chasers, and injectors present three different kinds of relations to life force. Smokers often begin in what is a signature narrative among smack addicts in Delhi by trying what was earlier 90s and 2000s, early 2000s called foreign charas, a hi-fi, expensive nasha, which came with the promise of an increase in sexual potency and extended time to ejaculation, which many claim that heroin initially offers, and initially being sometimes the first 10 years, among its other gratifications. Those who shift to chasing might manage to retain their swagger. For injectors, the high is more immediate and extreme, but their arms and eyes often testify to their more sharply waning trajectories. A strangely non-moral Durkheimian insight in suicide is that, I quote, suicidogenetic currents of different intensity might also have a relation to qualities that are socially affirmed. In relation to masculinity, heroism may be one such ambivalence, although the mode of heroism, including violence, can vary sharply depending on its relation to power, particularly political power. Ethnographically, we might ask, what kind of higher status networks can a small-scale hero or criminal connect to within a particular neighborhood? Here I began to notice a major difference between Trilokpuri and Sundarnagari, closely linked to the question of how collective violence becomes actualized or not. In Sundarnagari, while they were heroin and non-heroin consuming heroes, their trajectory of upward mobility could at most lead to larger gangs, such as those headed by Bali and Badshah, the two best-known badmashes or toughs in the neighborhood at present. The political landscape of Sundarnagari remains more dispersed and competitive, with the Kolis linked to the Aam Aadmi Party, said to have begun in Sundarnagari, where Arvind Kejriwal, Chief Minister of Delhi, had begun and others had begun an NGO many years back called Prevalence. As in other parts of North India, the Jatavs or Chamars remain allied primarily with the Bahujan Samaj Party, and the BJP in Sundarnagari retains its more traditional upper caste base, which is what the BJP used to look like for a long time, with two banya shop owners in conflict with the Pandit for the seat of the local MCD councillor. In contrast, politically, Trilokpuri is quite strongly defined by the MCD-employed Balmikis, whose post-colonial trajectory has involved a move towards now a much more explicitly Hindu identity, for instance by dropping Muslim and Christian names and rituals, as scholars like Nicholas Joule and Joel Lee, who did his PhD here, describe it. Further, over the last 20 years, Balmiki show a strong shift away from a long-standing affiliation to the Congress, instead to a more aggressive Hindu identity allied to the BJP. The epicenter of the so-called riot laboratory in Trilokpuri are basically two blocks known as the Gar or heart of the neighborhood. Block 28, an entirely Balmiki block known for its pig meat shops, since Balmikis are also the only caste that breed pigs in all of India. Right opposite block 28 is block 27, the Sunni heart of Trilokpuri, dotted with buffalo meat shops. So what we have then here is the buffalo meat sellers versus the pig breeders. On the Balmiki side, in their gradually strengthening affiliation with the BJP, there can now be a direct line of continuity between the smallest of heroes, like the heroin addict Naresh Balmiki, to to his neighbor, the formerly Satta running but now turned respectable MCD councillor Kamal Beniwal, a Valmiki leader of Block 28, and a step higher to the MLA Sunil Vaid, a Valmiki resident of Block 8 in Tirupuri, who in the 2014 riots as the MLA, in a move that's perhaps an element of all major riots, is said to have instructed the police and called up the commissioner, the SHO, to tell them to stay out of Tirupuri for 3 hours to give the Valmikis an opportunity to teach the Muslims a lesson. Sunil Vaid died of a heart attack just a few months later, on stage during a speech in divine retribution for his crimes, as the Sunnis of Block 27 insist. Sunil Vaid's wife Kiran Vaid has now emerged unfortunately as a leader in the neighborhood, and in his step with the times is much more openly anti-Muslim than Sunil Vaid himself ever was. As with the difference between injectors, there is a material element, but also an aspect that exceeds materiality in understanding the actualization of collective violence. So one aspect of the difference is the distinct political composition of the two neighborhoods, but a second, slightly more ephemeral difference lies in what anthropologists like Katherine Stewart and Patrick Eisenlohr call atmospherics. We might call this the energetic potential for a spark to catch. In Tirupuri, it felt like every few days I would hear of a potential or actual balwa, a skirmish, sparked by seemingly minor provocations. A day before Diwali in 2016, I arrived to find a police barricade suddenly in Block 28. I was told that the barricade was the result of an incident the day before. A Valmiki man celebrating the birth of his son celebrated by throwing money from his terrace, over which a fight broke out. The fight quickly escalated into stone pelting. The police arrived and a curfew was announced. On another moment, one evening in June 2017, I arrived to find Asif, my friend the kebab wala, slightly shaken. A cow had suddenly began to drag a goat outside his shop, and then a human child, right outside his kebab shop. I thought it was my Asnen, my son, he said. It felt like a balwa, a riot was going to start, but then it didn't. In contrast, while Sundarnagari often had an edgy atmosphere of petty crime, collective violence remained a more distant possibility, although in the incidents of explicitly Hindu-Muslim animosity that I traced through interviews and police reports from 2011 onwards and then more recently, it's possible to observe how differently brazen and mediatized the expression of anti-Muslim animosity has actually become in neighborhoods like these. In June 2016, for the first time ever in the neighborhood's history, Sundarnagari had a curfew. The chain of events leading up to the curfew at first feels almost like classic South Asian studies. Familiar though the symptoms may sound, the illness has intensified. A group of Muslim women in the mixed Hindu-Muslim block J of Sundarnagari approached a temple pandit asking him to turn down the volume of the temple loudspeaker and not do the evening aarti at the same time as the azan. The pandit responded very rudely and the women shouted back. A day later, the pandit, Parvesh Sharma, quickly produced an inflammatory YouTube documentary called The Truth of Sundarnagari, The Threat to Hindus. I went to interview him a couple of days after that and he asserted, I wanted to make this an international mamla, an international issue. I called the PM's office. Then I called somebody I know in Yogi Adityanath's office, that's the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh. Sundarnagari is on the border of Uttar Pradesh. The next day, Yogi ji sent 200 Hindus for the evening aarti, shouting Har Har Mahadev. The women also called for help and 50 or so Muslim men arrived from the Qureshi block O of Sundarnagari. The police, by all accounts, arrived almost immediately with senior officers like the SHO and the ACP and announced a curfew and installed a police post at the temple for the next 1 month. Parvesh Sharma, the Pandit, had some introspective moments in our conversation. If it was a Congress government, they would have said, Pandit mahal kharab kar raha hai, he's ruining the atmosphere, put him in jail. But I've been with the BJP since the 1980s, since the Jan Sangh time. We've done a lot of Sangharsh, struggle. When we first started collecting chanda, that is money, people were willing to give even 50 paisa. The police here are in cahoots with the Qureshis because of the illegal car market, which is a recycling market within Sundarnagari, notorious for recycling stolen car parts. The Qureshis give the police lakhs in monthly payments. That's why they turn up so quickly to protect them. My next task will be to get this Qureshi car market shut down. And so, the forces of life and death continue in these neighborhoods, producing suicidal genetic currents of different forms and intensities. One further question, after which I'll stop. Let's return from the broader landscape of heroic disorders, more specifically to heroin. What is the place of women in the landscape of heroin? Addiction psychiatrists in India, including at AIIMS, have tried to study substance abuse among women. It's a big topic in Indian psychiatry, which is very much more difficult, partly or mainly because of underreporting. In de-addiction centers, women patients are a rare exception, often coming just for one visit to find out what the medicine should be. According to available figures, including from our own household surveys, which included a component on gender and substance abuse, the most common substances for women include gutka, tobacco, non-opioid analgesics, alcohol, and benzodiazepine, like Valium and stuff. Aside from consumers, in a quirk of the gender division of labor, the main smack or heroin dealers in all of East Delhi and North Delhi are all women, with somewhat cinematic mythical names like Vidva, the widow in Simapuri, Gudiya, the doll, and Budiya, the old woman, a mother and daughter in Sundarnagari, and Tella and Tunya in Trilokpuri. Tunya, as it happens, is the niece of Jagga, one of the principal accused in the 1984 riots, known at the time as the Butcher of Trilokpuri. Unlike in Western hip-hop legend, drug dealers in India are not at all rich and not to wear gold chains or anything. With low-cost, stable, hierarchical arrangements and a large monthly payment to the police, many of the smack dealers have been in continuous operation for the last 20 years from the same locations, very much within the same neighborhood and from the same caste. While Tella and Tunya and Trilokpuri proved much harder to meet, among the drug dealers I managed to interview Gudiya, the doll, in Sundarnagari at her place of work in the Khet or farmland just behind the neighborhood, while the injectors and chasers convened. Interview might be a misnomer because we would mostly sit in silence. If I or someone else around asked a question, Gudiya, the doll, would reply in cryptic but clever one-liners. Where did you grow up? I tentatively asked the first time we met. Main sab kuch bhul gayi. I've forgotten everything, she replied. Why don't you keep ganja? Why don't you also keep ganja? A passing customer asked her. It will make it easier for us. एक मयान में दो तलवारें अच्छी नहीं लगती. Two swords don't look good in one sheath, Gudiya replied. Here, though, we are still in the realm of the heroic. To descend closer to more ordinary struggles, in following addiction trajectories over time, I began to feel that the heroes who survive often do because of the labor of a mother or a sister or a wife. And here I point to one further stark difference in the patient files of the two clinics, with the figures for accompanying family member visits significantly higher in Trilokpuri. Caring for a heroin addict might involve a quite heroic range of labors in itself, as any family member will confirm. One last ethnographic example, Ashok Angare, one of the most famous pickpockets of East Delhi, now retired, but still a legend among the current generation of younger pickpockets like Imtiaz. Pickpocket gangs, known as companies, divide up the city by bus and now metro routes. The most common occupation for a heroin addict in patient files also is occupation pickpocket. The head of a pickpocket gang is called a machine, with pusher companions for take bars. Gangs communicate with a code language known as Farsi. And here are some of the keywords of Farsi. In 5 interview sessions over 2 months, Angare narrated the trajectory of his rise and fall as a machine, with daring thefts, over 44 cases against him, 3 times Delhi out, that is when you're asked to leave the city and you're not allowed legally to return, 50 members of his company. He gave up being a machine 8 years ago and now runs a little stand selling chicken pakoras outside the cinema right opposite Sundarnagari, Gagan Cinema. His household with 5 children runs mostly on the income from his wife, Sunita, and his mother, both of whom work as sweepers in a private school in North Delhi. Angare's wife, Sunita, occasionally overheard our interviews as she returned from work. One afternoon when I visited, Angare had gone to the doctor and I asked Sunita if I might interview her. Having heard snippets of our conversation, always listening indulgently, or so it seemed to me, she re-narrated key incidents that she'd heard him narrate, adding a hue of vulnerability and her role, which Angare had entirely subtracted from his heroic narrative. Once for 6 months he was in jail. I could see him in pain, so to stop the 2-ton smack withdrawals, during our mulaqat, which is the official term for jail visit when you visit a family member, during our mulaqat I would carry a pudiya of smack for him. Pudiya would be a little packet, in my jura, my hairband. He must have told one of his jail companions that I was doing this because his wife also started doing this. Then one day she got searched and the pudiya in her bun was found. I was standing right behind her, sweating with panic. I thought, what will happen to our children if I also get arrested? Thankfully they didn't search me, saying she looks too straightforward. After that, I said I'm never smuggling smack into Tihar jail ever again. So after that, Angare arranged for a constable to come and collect the pudiya from our house. Then once he went into coma for 15 days. I went from hospital to hospital in Delhi searching for him. When he woke up, he asked the nurse, how long have I been here? He thought it was a few hours. The nurse told him he'd been there 15 days. He came back home crying, thinking that his family had abandoned him. But I had been searching for him. By now his company had disbanded. He sat on the terrace, crying, saying, no one will give me a job, so you'll have to work. So I joined the school as a temporary cleaner with his mother. He sat on that terrace for 3 years. He would drink, but he wouldn't do smack anymore. Then we helped him start a chicken stand. Like a Henry James story, suddenly Angare's heroic narrative seemed a little less real, which is not to say false. One of the conceptual issues I've been considering is how we might think of voice in mental illness, partly as the voice of an individual, such as Angare, but also as something that emerges in an ecology of relatedness. In the case of heroin, the male addict's trip, if you might call it, is not exactly hallucinogenic, nor is it entirely delusional, but the narrative often comes to be quite differently composed when viewed from the perspective of a laboring wife or mother, as distinct, say, from Angare and from his many admiring former assistants, some of whom I also interviewed since they were all patients in the Sundarnagari clinic. I'll end by gesturing to two wider implications of these chapters and of the book as a whole. First, in terms of urban form, inhabiting these resettlement colonies in Delhi intensified a dissatisfaction I've come to feel with the field of post-colonial urbanism, in which the third world city has come to be tightly structured in a teleological arc that moves from colonial urban planning to post-colonial failure, followed by now neoliberal infrastructure. None of this is necessarily untrue, but within this easily transposed global grid, there's little ethnographic and analytical space for the concreteness of local experience, and there are sometimes extremely sharp variations in what Arjun Appadurai had called the production of locality. On the question of local ecologies and mental health, there's a long tradition in urban sociology, particularly the Chicago School, as well as conversations in public health on what constitutes so-called neighborhood effects. What happens, though, most often implicitly or explicitly in these conversations, and particularly in public health, but even in the sociology, in Chicago sociology, is to show how mental well-being across various indicators is worse in poorer neighborhoods. What interests me here in the comparison of Trilopuri and Sundarnagari are the sharp differences that might emerge in understanding well-being and illness, even between proximate and demographically and economically quite similar neighborhoods. Further, within India, discussions of caste and mental health are beginning to emerge in conversations initiated by scholars like the psychiatrist and anthropologist Sushruta Jadhav, who argue that the term Dalit, sometimes translated as depressed caste, might also signal a higher disease burden for mental health issues. While not disagreeing, I hope to point to further layers of complexity. For instance, the very different trajectory of the two numerically dominant groups among North Indian Dalits, the Valmikis and the Chamars. Or, quite importantly, if we were to include neighboring urban poor Muslims in the calculus of caste and mental health, then the picture might look even more different. In terms of how one understands what mental health or mental health and illness is per se, one of the larger aims of this book is to offer new concepts of the psyche in ways that are not entirely defined, as it often is in critical theory, either by psychoanalysis or by psychiatry, or simply through a cultural critique of psychiatry and biomedicine, which is the most common kind of argument in anthropology. What might new concepts of the psyche look like? The book I'm writing is organized around three concepts: vitalism, skepticism, and an ecology of mind. I'll keep skepticism for another occasion. Today's presentation was on one element of an ecology of mind, neighborhood, and also on a strange form of vitalism, heroic and not so heroic experiments with waxing and waning life, and the intertwining of forms of life with forms of death and self-harm. To return to our title, Can a Nation Fall Sick? Is India going through some version of an opioid epidemic? Is there something like an ongoing experiment in majoritarian vitality that endangers the form of life called democracy? To all of these questions, my answer would be yes. That said, at such a moment, one task among others might be to refine the diagnostic tools through which we understand variations in the form of contagion and toxicity, and the threshold through which pathologies become livable or death-dealing. And here I'll stop with the hope and the doubt that as with any current, the intensities that I've tried to convey may or may not travel, but I hope they will. Thank you.
Thank you for a very richly textured, fascinating talk. Shall we open it up for questions?
Hi, I'm Kavita Sivakrishna. Thank you for a great talk. I was just wondering, I have two related questions really. I mean, what you're speaking about is really about urban poverty and addiction and a range of things that are associated. I mean, they're specific, of course, to Trilokpuri and the sites that you're speaking about. But one of the key kind of framings of neighborhood effects is really the understanding that how much of it is due to the neighborhood and how much of it is due to the population. Because of the kind of self-selection bias, that means similar kinds of people stay in certain neighborhoods, right? That's also one of the critiques of neighborhood effects. So I'm thinking to myself, what is specifically, in terms of context itself, what is the argument that you're trying to present, which is different from other sites of vulnerability and other sites and spaces, where you also have populations that are vulnerable to synthetic drugs and a range of other things. So you're quoting the work of bourgeois and other things. I was thinking of caste in particular that you brought out really nicely. Is there something that you found in particular from the spaces where, from the place you were observing, if there was something about neighborhood effects that was specifically contextual to the neighborhood and not to the people? Because there is this intersection between people and the spaces where they stay. And the studies of neighborhoods are limited by the fact that people say that Manchester could be like Malawi, right? I mean, it doesn't matter in a capitalist kind of setting where you have easy access to drugs. So what is the story here which particularly brings out the specificity of that neighborhood, as opposed to the people who are all lower caste, who are deprived from deprived contexts and other things. So I was just interested in that. The locality itself, how does that really stand out considering the critique of the notion of that, of neighborhoods themselves? Because I think it's tough to integrate that framing into what we look at. I'm a historian, to use that as a historian or an anthropologist. There's something particularly acontextual about it.
Thank you. And your also work is related to public health.
I work on history of science and health.
So that actually this is among the first times I'm presenting this, so this kind of thing is very helpful, and what you're offering or suggesting is actually, I've been trying to think about this in reviewing the literature from basically public health, which the aims people are very invested in, of course. And then also in urban sociology, currently there are lots of very interesting debates from people in sort of overlap between medical sociology, medical geography, with Ash Amin and people like that, who are trying to think about how one has a differentiated picture of well-being within a space like city. So you don't just think of it like alienation or something. So in this, the differentiation, I think the clarification that will be necessary in the, I should make a star on it, because in the article/chapter version of it, this will be a very critical clarification, which is that basically in this kind of neighborhood effects literature, the debate had stopped at a certain point at differentiating between two forms of causation, contextual and compositional. That is, neighborhood effects are either to do with the kind of people who coalesce in the neighborhood, or it's something to do with the neighborhood itself, that suppose is located very closely to some toxic dump or something, then it has particular kinds of health effects or whatever. So those were called contextual and compositional. But I have to think of basically when Bateson says ecology, and he says that how do you differentiate between ecology, it isn't bounded in the sense that there'll be circuits that will reach into other places, etc. But what is it to call something a milieu? And his father was a biologist, Bateson's father. So he's differentiating that in, basically in biology, when they say that you have organism A living here in this petri dish, and organism B living in this petri dish, but one generation later, and if they're biologically a generation can be born in say 1 month, they may have developed very different kinds of tendencies or very different kinds of results. So how does one name that difference that takes place? So there's something in the Bateson notion of ecology in which what I'm saying is that here are two neighborhoods. It is partly compositional. That is to say that the fact that Trilokpuri is Valmiki is defined by its Valmiki identity, certainly has something to do both with the fact that there's a certain kind of relation to BJP, etc. now, which makes certain violence possible. And similarly, there's a salaried economy and a set of effects that it has on gang culture, which means that heroin will develop in a particular way. And so from 2007 to now, one can see, according to the people who are still living, that this is what happened in the history of injectors and Trilokuri, this is what happened in the history of riots, and these are how these two things might be related. Sundar Nagari, statistically, demographically, and we matched it along because I was a psychiatrist, so I also got into it that let's use these household surveys properly and see how can you match what people's salaries are, how many renters and owners are there, because the psychiatrists were like, wanted to find cause A, B, C, they were very rigorous, and I actually enjoyed that after a while, having to disprove to them that it's not, they'd be like, there must be all renters in that and owners here. So in 100 households, we said how many renters, owners are exactly the same. So in that sense, to map the two neighborhoods to say that here are the conditions on which they're similar, but here's where the contingent element differentiated it. And yet it had something to do with the fact that these Valmiki, the caste composition is different and the salary structure is different, etc. But a very contingent set of deaths among Valmiki addicts led to this culture being formed in a relatively circumscribed space, where usually the places where addicts will collect are called hotspots. So those hotspots are like in a neighborhood there are 5 or 6, there are not that many. In Sundar Nagari there's 1, 2. So in a hotspot, if one gang begins to beat up injectors, then it certainly has an effect in the neighborhood. But whether that could have been predicted from Trilokuri's composition or context, no. Whether it could have been predicted that Sundar Nagari would be packed with injections lying everywhere. As soon as you enter, the first thing you see are injections, you see groups injecting themselves. You never see that in Trilokuri. So how that happened, I'm trying to describe. But it's neither contextual nor compositional, but it has something to do with ecology in the Bateson sense, but not in the effect sense.
Right, not in the effects. So, I think maybe one way to do it, since you're pursuing this work, is possibly, there's something almost neighborhood as compared to your title. There's a statelessness to this neighborhood almost. It kind of seems to operate in a bit of a vacuum.
No, AIIMS is a state-run, OST programs are state-run, the police is state.
The sense of a neighborhood and its links really with state policy. So much of that narcotic policy is also changing, right? There's the entry point and opening of narcotics, the changes in DSM, understanding the ways in which pain itself and narcotics have been allowed to circulate has to do with certain shifts that are happening at a macro level, also apart from the neighborhood. So in a way, as a historian, I kind of feel the timing and conjuncture of when you've situated this is also really important.
Very important. This is also, by the way, a very important point, which many of us, even though studying it, aren't aware of how much things in India are now further going to change because of this narcotic policy change. But basically the thing is that, on a small point, I would say that both these neighborhoods, as I studied and mapped institutions, etc., are state saturated. Neither are abandoned by the state.
Right.
There is more than ever state presence, and including the OST, opioid program. But you're right that the policy shift, basically the crux of it is that the medicines through which, opioids through which the American opioid epidemic has happened, very interestingly, Modi has recently liberalized the policy for opioids. And so now those opioids that were not available so easily in India are going to be much more available from 2018 onward. So heroin is one part of it, but the fentanyl and basically in India, they're either low dose opioids or high dose. And so tramadol is a very low dose, that's been available in India for a long time, but fentanyl and all these American ones are now going to be lush and abundantly available in India as per amendment to the NDPS, Narcotic Drug and Psychotropic Substance Act in 2014. But 2018 fentanyl was allowed into India. So there's going to be a boom in the opioid market and a lot of people are going to be...
Is fentanyl coming from the US or from China?
No, that is not fully clear as yet, as I tried to study where it will come and what will happen. In India, very often they start producing it immediately in this generic or kind of the market these things, organizes like it did around tramadol. So I'm not sure yet what will happen around fentanyl. But certainly it is coming in a big way into India.
Yes, with shifts in pain medicine itself.
Can I just pick up on the neighborhood issue with You presented the neighborhoods in terms of their initial identities, I guess, as product of this resettlement policy. And so they seem to have the same beginning, the same time, and such. But I'm wondering, and a lot of the, you presented a lot of information about the different neighborhoods. And I found myself thinking about sort of the difference between all this information that you've been gathering with the psychiatrists, which of course is important, but maybe Benjamin's idea of the focus on the storyteller and the kinds of stories of neighborhood or of a past that is something that exceeds that moment of resettlement. Was there a history or a memory of a previous, where they were before, for example, that carries over, and so these atmospherics are,
Especially from 1984.
and so to what extent are there these sort of historical memories that are come through story rather than information?
And can I just add one quick, you were talking about Hindu-Muslim tensions, but what about the reflection of the violence against Sikhs? How does that get played out?
No, I think this is a very important point, and one I've been thinking about for a while and want to take some time to write it, because basically in this phase of research I realized that it should split up into two different projects slightly. One will be this Vaccine and Waning Life, but over time I realized that Trilokpuri as such needs its own book, which will take longer to write because it's kind of more like my first book, but it is everything that's happened in post-colonial India has happened in an even more pressure cooker way in Trilokpuri. And you're absolutely right that in the narrative element of where people came from, there's a significant difference, but it doesn't seem to have played out in, I'm not sure how one would say that, no one really has an answer in some ways to say how does trauma translate exactly between generations in psychiatry or anything. There's no, but basically the narrative difference would be that Trilokpuri comes from the central most historical parts of Delhi. So the Muslim inhabitants of Trilokpuri are from that, the famous Turkman Gate demolitions, which everyone in Delhi remembers from Jagmohan and whatever there. And the Valmikis are from the heart of Harijan, where Gandhi came up with the term Harijan in Mandir Marg, in the Birla Mandir. So the Valmikis and the Muslims are both sort of from the most historical parts of Delhi. And the narrative memory of that is very immediate because most people are still alive. In the people who came to Trilokpuri are say in their 60s, 70s. So I did lots of interviews on how did it happen, what was the day, what did it look like when you came, what was the initial landscape like. And Asif, whom I mentioned, the kebab guy, his father was one of the first 8 residents of Trilokpuri from Turkman Gate. And so then very quickly they began to reorganize. Initially plots were assigned at random, and then people began to reorganize by caste, and including within Muslims. So like in Turkman Gate, if you lived, then if your caste was Gadhewale, that is the people who used to carry the dump on mules, then the Gadhewale lived in a line. Sundarnagari is a little more dispersed like that. That is that the residents all come in the same emergency period, that's when the initial plots are. But it's from different parts of North Delhi, some from here and there. But in terms of owner, all the data we have on owners and renters, that's what. So quantitatively looks very similar. They came at the same time. They're equally, Trilokpuri is marginally, say, richer in the sense that average rent, for example, in Trilokpuri will be, if you rent a house, an apartment, in Trilokpuri, it will be, say, you will be paying 1,800. If you rent an apartment in Sundarnagari, you will be paying on average 900 rupees or 1,000, 1,100 rupees. So there are minor differences like that, but on paper it looks very similar. But narratively, qualitatively, there is something quite different, but I don't know how to name it because it's, if a neighborhood is more historical, what can one say? It is more in-depth, kind of has things that have happened that are part of the history of post-colonial India. 84 riots, a lot of the people, I did lots of interviews on those because this photo I have, there's a friend or person I know called Gauri Gill, who's a photographer and very talented photographer, who did a very interesting photo project on the widows of Block 32. So most of the killing that happened in Tirupuri, the most historic line in Tirupuri, was in Block 32, which was an entirely Sikh block mostly. But the way in which the killing happened and things, people very much have now solidified a narrative around it. And all those people who participated in it, many of them are still there. And most of the killers, like the Jagga, whom I named, the butcher of Trilokpuri, he's still in Tihar jail. His daughter is the smack dealer in Trilokpuri. The two main brothers are right next in a village which used to pre-exist, Gujar caste village, which is right next to Trilokpuri. This was all farmland of that village. But people have found ways to, because they've been interviewed so many times on these issues, that at a certain point I realized I can't go out there and just get narratives on 84 from people, because some of them are married to Sikh women who were kidnapped at the time and are now living in Gujar households. So there'll be whispers, and then among the young people who are of my age or whatever, I mean, if I may still call myself young, but among the say people who are in their 30s, 40s, that is, who were children then, as I was, they remember it quite clearly, but with a very different view of what happened, and will remember that, oh, after the household was this thing, I went and stole a toaster from that household, and my father gave me a tight slap and said, go put the toaster back. So that's how Valmiki men will remember, have vague memories of that.
Actually, that was something that really interested me in your paper. It's really more about the meta-critical or meta-reflective, I should say, meta-reflective view of your paper. There's so much going on here, for one thing, and I was particularly interested in the way that you were ending the paper, which is about the personal voice and about the storytelling. And whereas in the beginning, there were a lot of statistics that you showed us, and I was wondering about how you reflect on the proportion of the kind of data in terms of numerical data, as opposed to the more subjective perceptions that you were getting towards the end of the paper. And in fact, I was thinking of Veena Das's essay, Composition of the Personal Voice, as a kind of text that I was mentally playing out, where she talks about writing partition stories in the midst of all this violence. And I wonder how you are approaching this question, because I clearly see that that's where you're going with this. But perhaps it requires you to also reflect more specifically in the work itself, how you are trying to work through the counterbalancing of the statistical enumerations with the composition of the personal voice. And this is particularly true with this heroizing that you are getting at.
So this is something I've been thinking about from in a way over the last few years, because like in ecology of mind, one unit is neighborhood, like in this, one way in which I'm going to think about it is neighborhood. The other, much more significant in many of the chapters, is household. That is, how does mental illness impact a household? And one of the most difficult things it's not like what Arthur Kleinman in anthropology had famously called illness narratives. The problem in illness narratives is that you can sit down and interview somebody and say, how did the problem begin and what would you refer to it as? And then you find that actually, if you interview their sister or brother, the difficulty in mental illness as distinct, say, from diabetes or as distinct, say, from cancer, is that the caregiver's burden, as they call it in medicine, will always be strong in any illness. And illness will have an impact on the whole household. In mental illness, the difficulty will be that narrative itself or language becomes something that falls under doubt. That is to say that, is my son lying to me? Or is he hearing this voice? How do I deal with the fact that he may have stolen 200 rupees in any addiction, depression, schizophrenia? So that's something I've been thinking about a lot, that what does voice mean in mental illness if one takes it not only as an individual voice. And each condition seems to have its own specific problems that it poses. In heroin, it does have this issue of the heroic and of a kind of masculine voice, and the way in which masculine feminine perspectives cut into each other directly. That is to say that suddenly the mother or the daughter or the wife's perspective will suddenly dissolve the hero into something quite different, while not saying he's lying. So for me, the issue of where I'll try and, I'm not sure how I clarify it exactly, but the narrative versus number issue, like in Durkheim I feel, and in this I haven't explicitly said it, but one of the things I got uncomfortable with was this very standardized anthropological way of saying that global health is just about numbers, and somehow we mistrust numbers. That is true, but numbers, if one takes it to be a form of expression like words, and says that what is it that the story that it's telling, as words would also tell a story. Similarly, numbers are also one form of expression and storytelling. So in this, I'm thinking of numbers as, say, creating a landscape as one would with words. So I'm not totally sure yet as I write it what status numbers will come to have and what I'm thinking about. I'm not an expert with numbers. I can certainly use household surveys, and maybe being with psychiatrists, I got used to having to tell them that, look, if I'm saying it's not this, then here are some numbers to show you also why it's not this. But it's not that numbers count as a proof while words are just subjective. Both are offering proofs of a certain sort. But if one doesn't take numbers as something one is necessarily hostile to, and yet preserving my, I mentioned Henry James particularly because I do consider him a great thinker of voice, as I've encountered it in mental illness, where you can have got the whole narrative and have no idea what actually happened.
Yes.
And you can narrate it as kind of rigorously as possible, and have no idea what perspective. So it's not even rational. It is just that the whole thing just dissolves. So it's like that, even with numbers or words.
So we have a few more now. Now everybody says, so let's start with you and then George Deere, and I think I saw part-time and then you.
And if we are at all at any point running out of time, then it would be nice to gather all the questions so that I don't miss any questions.
Yeah. What time should we stop?
We have about 10 minutes or so.
Okay. Maybe we should. Yeah, never mind.
So you suggested that there is a link between the two kinds of illnesses that you have suggested, so mental illness and like a political illness. You suggested it but didn't really articulate it, and I was wondering if you could. And the other question is a more delimited question, which is, why is it that all of these dealers are women?
Hi, thank you. You mentioned earlier in this circuit there was a Sufi healer as well.
Sorry,
There was a Sufi healer as well in the circuit. I was wondering how that played a role, and also if he troubled the creation of new concepts at all. As a Sufi healer, how does that work? And thinking about like the hero, for example, in relationship to Greeks, but then how does the Sufi think about the hero, or even the voice, for example? Thank you.
Well, this is to go back to this question of numbers and the narratives. Because when you set up this contrast between Bhrigupati and Sundarnagari, in terms of the numbers, basically you were trying to suggest that despite the relative demographic sort of similarities, the crucial difference is that one is riot prone and the other is not, right? And see, in explaining this, one crucial demographic contrast was the fact that Bhrigupati is inhabited by largely Valmikis there, and there's this whole history of that becoming more sort of BJP supporters, etc. And in terms of sort of standard political explanations, that would be a fairly strong explanation. But you want to get something more than that. And this is where I'm a little, you see, because when you say kind of Durkheimian, understanding. You see, Durkheim, after all, looked at social facts as like things, right? They were independent of will and so on and so forth. So, unless you were claiming, and I'm sure you're not, that among those who actually perpetrate violence in communal rights and so on, there is a significant proportion of drug addicts. You're not clearly saying that. So there's something else that you are trying to get at in terms of explanation, which is not like a sort of causation model as in Durkheim. Right? It must be something else. And that's, I suspect, what Gauri was trying to ask you. You know, what is this? And you know, just the heroism thing, except as a kind of, I'd say, metaphorical way. What is it that's about that connects the drug phenomenon to you know, this political violence?
I kind of have the same questions. I mean, I just wanted to ask you to elaborate on the sort of articulation between the issues of different kinds of drug addiction and rioting and masculinity in the media. And I think that's the most intriguing part of your talk, but I wasn't quite able to stitch it all together. But I guess you'll probably be doing some of that with the answer to this question.
Should we add one more?
Please, yeah. No,
Just
it's
small.
helpful.
It's just a small one. I was very struck by the fact that the UP figures were, since I go to UP a lot, that the UP figures were so high. And you explained, of course, that that's not per capita, but just a large figure. But I'm just wondering, speaking of neighborhood and not just neighborhood, but the mega city that is Delhi, how does all this look from the perspective of a smaller location? I suppose
Per capita Delhi is very high, right? Per capita.
Low, isn't it?
But per capita it would be quite high. So you something like 3 point something lakh, whereas 10 point something for UP.
Yes, you mean in the heroin addiction?
Delhi would be quite high, you know.
But yes, but what I'm thinking is,
No, what does it look like is what you're saying.
yeah, it's the specialized concentrations of populaces that you seem to have. That you're describing something quite specific. I guess I'm just wondering, as I often am about my blindness, you know, not having seen this or experienced it, not knowing it inside me in any way.
Yeah. You have a question?
Sort of look like you might.
Okay, so just to answer some of them as rigorously as possible, one can. So one question around actually there's a linked set of questions around mental illness, addiction, political illness. So I don't know if it does justice to all of them to offer one kind of answer beginning with the Durkheim issue that you raised, which is maybe at the heart of it. Conceptually for this chapter, certainly at the heart of it, which is to do with the idiosyncratic, but not, thankfully I'm not alone in this. There's a group of people who suddenly arrived all at the same time like monkeys who evolved in the same direction, at the same kind of new reading of Durkheim. So like William Mazzarello's Vermana Mass Society, and Stefan Henrich, who's at MIT. But independent of them, I didn't even know they were doing this. As my first book was writing on this headless horseman and how one understands kind of popular religious life, I realized that Durkheim, basically the elementary forms of religious life, is studied as a book about social fact, social whole, all of the stuff that's commonly taught in social theory. But basically the crux of Durkheim, as one then begins to see it in that way, is that its structure is one element of a two-pronged thing, and the other element is energy. And that in elementary forms of religious life, he's saying that when a spirit medium, or these are forces that you come into contact with, which are like an electric shock. And I am not using this term in a metaphorical way, I mean this in a real way. And that I had used when I used to encounter the spirit mediums who would say that religion is that it's like an electric shock to be possessed and stuff. So then I had built from that. Later in reading Suicide, I realized that it's taught purely as a structural text. That here's neighborhood A, neighborhood B, or province A, province B. Here's Catholic, Protestant, so it's taught in that way. The thing that Durkheim is saying that what makes the system move is in that Suicide book. He's saying that I'm exploring the flip side of elementary forms of religious life, because elementary forms of religious life was about the energies, communitas that people use later, that join. And this, he's saying, alienation is not the explanation, anomie is one among other varieties, but among other varieties of what? He says the thing I'm interested in called, and it's only there in 2 or 3 footnotes, that's suicidogenetic currents, which are something like the opposite of what brings people together, which was in the elementary forms of religious life. So in this, I'm saying that what interests me in the metaphysical dimension of it are that what are these kind of currents of toxicity or negativity that would flow through a neighborhood, in which the opposite of social bonding would express itself, but not in the form of anomie or alienation. So alienation would be one among other ways, because actually heroin addicts are not alienated. They are a very tight group, and they are sometimes very good friends, but those friends can murder each other when the day comes, if it comes. So heroin addicts also die extremely gruesome deaths at each other's hands, but they also have honor codes and pickpocket gangs and stuff like that. The parallel is not to say that it's the same and one leads to the other at all. I'm saying that what is my object of inquiry? It is suicidogenetic currents. What are the ways in which people harm themselves within a neighborhood collectively? Heroin being one instance, and riots being another instance. Both are related to some form of masculinity and some disorder of masculinity and some disorder of collectivity of some sort. But they don't cause each other, so it's absolutely not a causal explanation in that sense. But there are varieties of sickness in which you're understanding the symptoms, that how did they emerge, what happened. But they both have this element that is don't make much of, and the conclusion maybe I have to properly bring it together as I write this out properly, which is what is atmospherics in this, and what does the term metaphysical mean when I'm saying that there's something about the energy of Trilopoli that makes it like this, which Valmiki, there are many Valmiki neighborhoods, and there are other Jahangirpuri, Sultanpuri, which are Valmiki Muslim also. But in this concentrated, strange way, that 27 and 28 here, of those photos that you see, are atmospherically charged, that a cow pulling a goat makes someone feel that a riot could break out. That there's something about the metaphysical element that I'm saying, the energy of the place, which is what Durkheim is saying, that I'm interested in this, I'm a student of energy, as much as I'm interested in social facts, etc. So the two are not related, and I'm not saying that Modi and heroin addicts or that kind of thing, there is a similarity, but it's not just metaphorical. It is to do with an inflated masculine form. How do you falsely inflate the male ego? Or how do you falsely inflate aspiration? A heroin addict says that when you have heroin, you become braver. And there is something to do with that experiment with vitality that is not metaphorically, and it's not parallel, it's not causing each other, but I'm saying it's some disorder of a certain sort. Then the others are a little easier. Why are smack dealers women? I think there are two factors. Many of them are widows of smack addicts. You asked. Many of them are widows of people who began to sell smack and then became part of a network, but it's a particular kind of arrangement that they reach with the police. That the police are a little dependent on. There are two categories that are only women. The chief smack dealers who operate from homes. The roadside smack dealers may be men sometimes, of which there will be very few, but the ones who operate like a shop, like a business, those are women. And the principal mukhbars, that is police informants, are also women. And this has something to do with the fact that it is a less hostile relation, in that they become a particular kind of personality. But in becoming that personality, they're also sort of like Dawn-like figures, with a large army of men under their command. Large could be 10, it could be 20. But it's a particular kind of personality. So I'm not fully sure what the cause is, but these are some of the factors and all. The Sufi healer, actually, there's 1 or 2 chapters which are specifically on that. on the shrine on Badaयूं, on journeys to the shrine from Trilokpuri there. But since Matthew and Eric had already heard that chapter, I didn't want to present it again. So in order to present something new, I presented a new chapter. But that is something I've tried to write. Is much harder in a way to write. Really strong, great work on it already by people close to us and sitting around us. But in this case, the healer plays a very specific role for some reason. I mean, the reason conceptually is clear, that in Sufi terminology, a mental illness would be called asra, that is some effect. And within that, psychiatric terms, you come to a Sufi healer for schizophrenia, depression, I'm hearing voices, I can't get out of bed, etc. You would never come for heroin addiction to a Sufi healer. For more variety of complex reasons. And different kinds of illnesses. There was some question also about the UP, sorry. Professor Holi's question. UP, how does it look like from UP? Actually, I've never asked that question of myself. The fact is that Sundarnagari, this is UP. So Sundarnagari, you cross the road and you're in UP. Most of the people in Trilokpuri, some of whom come from UP, have properties there which are highly under dispute. And so migration in that sense is not that they've left a village and come to the city kind of situation. It will be like a cousin or my brother lives in UP and I live here. UP is where also a lot of the heroin is produced. And so there are 3 places where heroin is most made and comes into Delhi. Although in presenting it, people often have a much larger map about the Golden Triangle on one side, which is Thailand, Burma, Laos, and the Golden Crescent, which is Afghanistan, Iran, and something else. But I've never seen anyone have heroin from either of those places. The heroin in these neighborhoods is from UP because I think it's a narrative that feels very convincing that it comes from Afghanistan. But UP is very important in this landscape. And what it looks like in terms of addiction is something that is numerically quite large. It has higher numbers seemingly than Punjab and stuff. But there's a particular history of opium related to particular places in which the transformation was quite important in the 80s. So in psychiatrists often study that, called the traditional users versus the new users. And the traditional users are those for whom opium was even before British, the Opium Commission, etc. So there will be ways of understanding that which I have to think about.
I just wanted to add
Last
to that.
question, no.
Mostly relating to, if anyone else wants to ask, because this is my second question, I wouldn't like to bog this.
We collect them both and then
And then we'll,
I just have a simple thing which comes out of an experience I had in a village in Punjab in 1965, where I was introduced to the village a Fuji, who offered me a puff on his glove, everybody looking at it. And he said to me, you don't want this, of course, because you drink alcohol. And alcohol causes fighting. Female was calm and sweet. So that's the introduction to it. I was thinking of that. What about alcohol? And illicit alcohol versus so on. Is there, I assume other people have studied it in other ways. Is there some sort of link in the differentiation?
So I actually wanted to add to that. The way people understand this, addiction is that you open yourself to one kind of addiction and it opens itself in turn to others, right? So juvenile delinquents who begin to smoke will then begin to drink, and then drinking leads to alcohol and a range of other things. So what are these pathways that are happening? And when I worked with in rehabilitation colonies in Punjab and parts of Delhi, mobility is a very, very important part of these places. And the way you describe it, a lot of these people seem to be there and present. So are there lots of actors also who are going in and out? I mean, these are very unstable kind of communities and places. So that's why I feel that the numbers look so stable in a way, but what they don't convey is the narrative of that mobility.
Yeah.
And I feel these surveys really hide that because they come year after year, they have a temporality and cycle in that they collect this data. And I find that rather than this neoliberalism or whatever surveys, my problem is not with the methodology, but what they really convey in terms of a certain kind of scalar stability, right? Which while actually these are deeply unstable and mobile places. Both the mobility of materials, as in the drugs, but also of the people themselves. Maybe you must be doing this in another chapter, I'm sure, but I just wanted to...
No, I'll give short responses to both. Very important. So very quickly. Alcohol is very important. Very crucially linked to caste also. Because for the Balmikis, alcohol is a completely different substance. In Muslims, it will be like alcohol is haram. Heroin is okay. So it's a little bit quite variable depending on what is permissible within a particular form of life, etc. But the feeling that one gets, that's something I'm deeply interested in, and those scientists and psychiatrists and neuroscientists are also interested in. That what do you understand as heroin's experience? If it's not like the classic, it's not like beat poetry or something, when you're not seeing purple elephants and things, then what is its relation to pain and subjectivity and things like that? And how is it different from alcohol? And opium in its traditional use, the strange thing is it was quite ambivalent. People could call it an upper, depending on how it's prepared. People could call it a sedative. The entire thing depends on how you treat it. But the same thing can be a thing you'd have it before war and go in with elephants and things, or you'd have it when you're relaxing. So depending on what the king needed to do, it was prepared in a particular way. The pathways is very important also. I've come to recognize among the anthropological classics, other than this Durkheim, Van Gennep's book Rites of Passage, which is to say that how does one grow up in a neighborhood? And heroin is often linked to that. People, psychiatrists do this a lot, pathways and things, in which they say you begin by sniffing glue, then you have ganja, cigarettes, then you maybe graduate to heroin, etc. So for me it was that when is the pathway, so-called pathway of predictable drug, this thing called intoxication, how is it interrupted? And it's often interrupted, and mental illness is also fundamentally linked, I have to see, to what in my earlier book I have called thresholds of life, but here it depends on rites of passage. That is to say, when somebody grows up in a particular way and some rite of passage is interrupted. Let's say you didn't get a job, where at a time when you were meant to get a job. Often these interrupted rites of passage are a trigger for some kind of mental illness. In this, the way out of a predictable drug trajectory is sometimes when, like Asif's case, he suddenly one day felt that I really need to be there for my kids, among other things. So now both his kids are in tuition. He runs a kebab shop, goes gets his medicine, but that's because he learned to recognize himself as a householder at a certain point in time, as distinct from a gang leader, cool guy in the neighborhood. He's still that, but he grew up from a boy into a man in a particular way. And so often the thing is interrupted in some passage from boyhood to manhood. And this movement from one stage of life to another.
Please join us across the hall for a small reception. You can just,
We can continue our conversations there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. I wasn't sure if there was